Hey everyone, welcome in. Today's deep dive is a little different.
We're going to be talking about something that's universal, but often really difficult. Grief and loss.
And we're looking at it through what our source material says about grief counseling, specifically in Northeast England.
It's a tough subject, definitely, but I'm hoping that by the end of this, you'll feel a little bit more prepared to understand grief, the support that's out there, and some ways to navigate those difficult times.
So the text defines grief as this complex emotional response to loss.
And one thing that really struck me was how the text emphasizes these unique challenges of grief in Northeast England, especially how it's connected to that strong sense of community and identity there. Yeah, that's really important because even though experiencing loss is universal, the way it's dealt with, even just supported, can be really tied to local culture, local values.
Right, it's not just about having resources, but about those resources actually meaning something to the people they're meant to help.
Absolutely. And that's where this idea of localized support becomes so important.
Think about it. Counselors who get those specific cultural things about the region, maybe even using local traditions in what they do.
That can make a huge difference for someone grieving.
And when it comes to those resources, our text talks about some specific support systems in Northeast England.
And two names that pop up are the NHS and Cruise Bereavement Care.
For anyone who might not know about those, can you give us a little overview?
Sure. The NHS, the National Health Service, is how healthcare is funded in the UK, publicly funded.
So they offer a whole range of services, and that includes grief counseling.
What's interesting is the text contrasts how broad the NHS is with Cruise Bereavement Care, which is much more specialized.
Cruise is a well-known charity, been around a while in the UK, and they really focus on helping people who've experienced loss.
So it's almost like there are different paths you can take, depending on what you're looking for when it comes to that support.
Exactly, and that's what really resonated with me, this idea of having choices.
Because even if you aren't in Northeast England, understanding what could be out there.
Whether it's, government-funded, nonprofit, faith-based, even just organized by the community, realizing that is a good first step.
It's like having a place to start, right? When it feels like you're in this overwhelming place, especially when you're grieving.
That's it. And speaking of going through the grieving process, our text goes into the stages of grief.
But what I liked is how it doesn't treat them like a checklist, more like a framework.
Makes sense. It's not like you finish one stage and move on to the next, right?
Not at all. It's a lot more fluid, depends on the person.
But I think it helps to have this framework, just to understand those emotional phases you might go through.
So could you walk us through those stages a bit? Give us an idea of what the text talks about.
Of course. So the first stage the text mentions is denial, that feeling of numbness, disbelief, like there's no way this is happening.
Then there's often this wave of anger, which can show up in all sorts of ways.
Frustration, getting irritated easily, even being angry at the person who's gone, even if that doesn't make sense logically.
It's like your emotions are trying to understand something that your brain just can't process.
Yeah. And trying to find that meaning is often what leads to bargaining, where we're trying to get some control back.
Thinking, what if I had done this differently? Or if only this one thing had been different?
That if only, thinking can be powerful.
It can. And then when the reality of the loss sinks in, there's often a period of depression, a really deep sadness.
Important to say, this doesn't automatically mean clinical depression, more like a natural reaction to the weight of it all.
It's like this exhaustion emotionally from dealing with everything that's happened.
Yes, and that's why it's so important to be kind to yourself during this time. The text really stresses that.
It's okay to not have it all together, to have good days and bad days. It's not a straight line, grief.
And then finally, the text talks about acceptance.
I imagine that doesn't mean you're suddenly okay with what happened, right? It's more like learning to live with it.
You got it. It's about that loss becoming part of your life story, finding a way to keep going, but still remembering and honoring the person or thing you've lost.
And that journey to acceptance, it's different for everyone.
And it makes you think this is where having those support systems really matters, like even more so when you're trying to reach that point of acceptance.
Oh, absolutely. The text spends a lot of time on those practical things you can do to cope, which I thought was really useful.
Because it's not enough to just understand those stages. You need ways to handle it day to day, right?
So what are some things they highlight? What can people actually do?
Well, one thing that stuck with me was how important routine is.
When you're grieving, it's easy to just let that structure go.
But the text makes the case that keeping some things normal can really ground you.
It's like creating your own stability when everything feels unsteady.
Exactly. And along with that, there's journaling.
Not just to work through your feelings, but also to see your own progress.
Sometimes we don't realize how far we've come unless it's right there on paper.
That's true. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and not see our own strength.
Right. And speaking of strength, the text really pushes support networks.
Connecting with people who get it, friends, family, a support group that shared experience makes a huge difference.
It's like that feeling of, okay, I'm not alone in this, and I bet that's especially important in a place like Northeast England, where those community ties run so deep.
Definitely. And lastly, there's self-care.
And I don't mean like spa days, although those are nice.
I mean the basics, good food, enough sleep, moving your body, the things that keep you going.
Because it's easy to let those things slide when you're grieving, but they're the base for everything else.
Exactly. The text is clear. These are tools, not instant fixes.
There's no one way to get over grief. It's finding what works for you your own way and giving it time.
And sometimes that means getting professional help, which can be scary, but the text gives some good practical advice on finding a counselor.
It does. And I like that it goes beyond the obvious, like checking if they're qualified, if they've worked with grief before.
It talks about that connection you need to feel really heard and understood.
Because in the end, it's about trusting someone to guide you through this really personal experience. So as we wrap up today, one thing sticks with me. We focused on grief and loss in Northeast England. But what can those of us elsewhere take from this?
That's a great question. For me, it's about that emphasis on personalized support. Grief isn't the same for everyone. Finding resources that fit your needs, your background, that's key.
So taking that local approach, that awareness of community identity, and using it wherever you are.
Finding resources that understand your story, your values, your experience with loss.
Exactly. And remembering that healing takes time. Be patient, use your support system, and don't be afraid to reach out for help.
That is such an important point. So wherever you are in your own grief journey, you're not alone. And if you're looking for more resources, more support, we've got some helpful links in the show notes for this episode. Thanks for being here for this deep dive.